I found a recipe for Dong Phuong king cake online and I'm here to test it. One of New Orleans' favorite king cakes in recent years has become Dong Phuong Bakery in New Orleans East. There's a special softness and tanginess to this cake, and a lot of people say the frosting is what makes it. I myself am a fan. I've said before that Randazzo's is my favorite king cake, but this one's up there as well. And I do have my own recipe for a Randazzo style king cake, which I've gone through a couple times on this channel, but I was browsing and I stumbled onto this Dong Phuong style king cake recipe. So I'm going to take you through my process making it. So I'm probably going to be talking about the similarities and differences between this recipe and my original king cake recipe, just because I think it's kind of intriguing, and I think that'll help me assess things at the taste test. So as you know, when I follow recipes, I'm not going to put the ingredients or say the ingredients and the amounts in this video, because if you want to make this, you should go look at the original recipe from the original creator, which I'll link in the description. But either way, we're starting by proofing our yeast in some milk that I've already warmed. This is pretty standard. It's pretty much what I do in my recipe. But instead of using regular sugar as a sweetness source in this dough, this recipe uses honey. By the way, you should never measure honey in anything but a kitchen scale. Save yourself the mess. I'm just gonna mix this up and let it proof for a few minutes.
Frothy boy.
And now we dump in our eggs. I do like how this recipe puts all of the wet ingredients into one piece instead of having to add them separately. But now we get our dry ingredients ready. And they use all-purpose flour here instead of the bread flour that I use. In my experience, it doesn't make a huge difference, but it has a little less protein content, which can affect the chewiness of the cake at the end. But people have said that they've substituted the bread flour for all-purpose flour in my recipe, and they haven't had any issues. Some salt as well. Okay, a preliminary whisk of the dry ingredients. And then we just slowly pour in the wet ingredients. Okay, that's starting to come together, so I'm going to add in my softened butter bit by bit. Okay, this dough is far too wet for me to work with, so I'm going to add some more flour. It's pretty usual for me to have to do with recipes like this. I usually have to add more flour than is asked for. Alright, back to it. Alright, so this looks just about mixed. You can see light through it. It stretches pretty well. It's a pretty wet dough, but I don't want to add too much more flour. I've already kind of added a lot. Yeah, this is your pretty standard enriched dough for lots of different baked goods. It's not quite like the brioche that I made. You don't make a tangjong paste at the beginning, but I think it'll come out pretty similar. So I'm going to get this into a bowl to start letting it rise. And I'm going to come back in about 30 minutes for some folds. Alright, after 30 minutes, it's time to do some gluten strengthening folds. This is a pretty common technique when making doughs, but I've never done it before, so I'm not super well versed in it. They say to just kind of tuck your hand underneath the bottom and pull up and then cross it over. And we're just going to turn the bowl and repeat that. And then we cover and repeat that 3 times in 30-minute intervals. Fold number 2. Fold number 3. Fold number 4. Now this goes nighty-night in the fridge. Alright, it's tomorrow. The dough kind of rose, but not as much as mine usually does in the fridge. I assume because I deflated it with all the folds. But it's time to roll it out. Let me get some flour down first. Just trying to get a rectangle shape here, as usual. These corners are usually pretty stubborn, so I just try to kind of round around them and make them a little sharper. It's never perfect, but it does a little better job than if they're super rounded. So this is about the size that was listed in the recipe, so I think we're good. Now to get our filling started, I have some butter and heavy cream. Just gonna brush this on. This is very similar to what I do in my king cake, except I use softened butter instead of melted butter like we have here. And now the heavy cream. This is gonna help our cinnamon sugar filling stick really well. Which, speaking of, it's really easy to make. You just pour some cinnamon into some brown sugar with a pinch of salt, and then just mix that to combine. I also forgot a vital step, which we're supposed to poke holes in this dough every few inches before we brushed on the butter and the cream. Hopefully doing it now doesn't ruin the recipe. I think it'll be fine. Now we just add our filling. It's looking good. I'm just lightly packing it in so it sticks really well. And lastly, we just need to roll this up. It's kind of like a cinnamon roll, but instead of rolling this all the way across, we're going to roll each end halfway through. You'll see what I mean. And then I just bring this side towards the halfway point. Alright, now we need to carefully flip this onto our baking sheet. Well, that didn't work. There we go. And then we fold this around into a U shape. Try to pinch these ends together so that it's one cohesive unit. First, I'll stretch it out a little bit so it's a little more flat. Alright, that looks kind of decent. Okay, before we let this do its final proof, I'm going to go through and cut some slits around the side like they show. This is gonna help the dough fan out a bit, I guess, and maybe cook more evenly. This doesn't look exactly like theirs does, but hopefully it's good enough. Okay, now we're just gonna cover this with a towel and let it rest for a couple of hours. All right, this is risen for like 2 to 3 hours. It looks great. They don't say to put an egg wash on top of this, which I feel like that's kind of normal for something like this, but we'll see what happens. I'm gonna toss it in the oven and we'll see when it's done. In the meantime, I'm gonna put together the frosting. It's just your basic cream cheese frosting, but it does have an element of brown butter. I made this off camera last night to solidify in the fridge. I think it's a great idea and it'll add a good depth of flavor to this cake. I am making a double batch of this frosting because I'm making 2 cakes, if you haven't noticed yet. Hopefully there's room in this stand mixer for both. So I'm gonna start by breaking down the butter and the cream cheese in here. Okay, now to start mixing this into an actual frosting, I'm gonna add bit by bit of this powdered sugar that I measured out. Just don't wanna do it all at once because it will explode. This also needs some whole milk, but I'm gonna be sparing with it, just trying not to overdo that. Getting there, just adding milk until it's the right consistency. By the way, there's no vanilla extract in this entire recipe, which I guess is normal for the cake. I don't have one in mine either, but I'm surprised to not see it even in the frosting, but I guess that's how they do it. All right, I think we've got the velvety frosting texture that we were looking for. Let's give that a try. Very strong taste of brown butter. It's not as much cream cheese flavor as I expected, but it'll probably be really good on top of that cake. Which, speaking of, this one is fresh out of the oven. I had to tint it with foil towards the end because it was browning too much before the inside was done. But it does look good. It's gonna be a while before this cools, but what we need to do while it's still warm is brush the top with some heavy cream, which is exactly what I do in my king cake recipe. Pretty common thing to do with pastries like this after you finish baking them because they get a really hard outer shell, and this will help soften it up, but keep it rich. And now we just basically wait for this whole thing to be cooled off so that we can ice it. All right, both my cakes are done and they've cooled enough, so I'm gonna start frosting them. I'm gonna do this at the same time so that I can distribute this frosting evenly. I'll try to keep this on top of the cake and not let it run off too much if possible. Alright, these look good so far if you ask me. While this frosting is setting, we're just going to add on our sanding sugar. If you've watched my other king cake videos, you know I'm not a really big fan of this crystallized sugar. But in order to keep the integrity of the recipe, I'm going to be doing it like they do it. I'm no artist, but I'm going to try to get this fairly even. Alright, I'm sure you might be able to do better, but I think this is passable. Oh yeah, nice and soft, looks amazing. And you can just see how soft and moist this dough stayed throughout the baking process. All right, no time for vanilla milk because I have to rush through this. As usual, I'm bringing this to a church gathering tonight, so hopefully everybody enjoys it, but me first. Yeah, that is Dong Phuong. I don't know if the person that posted this had inside information or knew the recipe, but this hit it pretty spot on. The tenderness of the inside of the cake is unbeatable. It's so good. And I was worried about how the brown butter and the frosting might overpower all the flavors in the cake, but once you put it all together, it comes out really well. That tang of the cream cheese just completes this, kind of like how the lemon juice in my frosting does, but this is a little bit different. Yeah, this is definitely a success. Now, does it beat my original king cake recipe? I think that comes down to a question of what kind you like better. I think I'm always going to default to Randazzo's king cake as my favorite, but a lot of people prefer the Dong Phuong style. So I think depending on what you like better or what you're in the mood for, pick the recipe accordingly, and you're not going to be disappointed. This did come out really great. If I could change one thing, I would do an egg wash on the outside before I bake. I think it just comes out a bit too dry. The heavy cream at the end helps, but having both steps before and after really makes a difference. But I really wouldn't change anything else. The recipe is really straightforward and easy to follow, so I'm going to link it below like I said. I highly recommend you try this if you have the time or if you want to taste something like Dong Phuong style. But that's going to do it for me today. As always, thank you all for watching. Be blessed, and I will see y'all next time. I might have to start sweetening my doughs with honey instead of sugar.